Hello.
Hey there.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good.
All right, let's start. Let's go over the meetings from last week, or I should say from this week. We had a DevoWorm meeting. We had a Cognition Futures meeting, and then we had an admin meeting yesterday, which was in place of our open source meeting. So let's start off with our DevoWorm meeting. So this was our DevoWorm meeting for last week. We went through some introductions. I talked a little bit about Barshan's pull request. So this was feet sulfate for SGel, SGel being his platform that he's working on. And congratulations to Barshan for continuing on. And then we talked about this paper. Now this is known as the Spud cell paper. So this is, the title here is a chemically defined synthetic cell capable of growth and replication. So it's one of these early life papers, and the shorthand for it is Spud cell. And so we went through this paper a little bit, talking about what they were doing. And it's basically the type of thing that they do in early life. They were early life research. It's the type of thing they do in origin of life research. They take like a minimal genome. They have like sort of a minimal cell that isn't really a cell, and then they see what they can boot up and get to work. So they show this. So the idea is to show that the cell is the fundamental unit of life, and they do these experiments where they basically have a system where you have a vesicle, you have DNA replication, you feed that vesicle with biochemicals, and then you measure metabolic activity. You grow the cell, it divides, and they evaluate it. So this is something that you can use to study early life, but you can also use it for bioengineering purposes. And so this is just some figures from the paper. They show that they can replicate a cell cycle. They have this multiplasmid genome that gets transcribed within the vesicle. They have these membrane channels that get expressed, and then you get this nutrient uptake, and you get division not through the typical way that cells do this, but through crowding of the membrane and subsequent fission. And so we went through a number of the figures in the paper. It was a highly technical paper, so it wasn't something that we got too deeply into the details of what was going on, but that was that paper. So yeah, it gotten a lot of press, but it's really just kind of a classic origin of life using vesicles paper. So it's interesting. And then I think Morgan mentioned that he had some other thoughts on it, or he had read the paper on his own. So, all right. So then the next paper we talked about in DevoWorm was this blastoporal organizer and a ctenophore. And so this is reflecting back on some of the very early developmental biology experiments where they discovered something called the organizer. And so this is a chemical gradient, or a set of chemicals that organizes axial order. So instead of having just kind of a mass of cells, you start to get axial order from those cells. And this is done through this organizer. And so what they talk about in this paper is that we think about the organizer as being something that you see in bilateria. All of the examples of Hough genes, for example, a lot of the model organisms for developmental biology are mostly in bilateria. And so this is something that, of course, people have later found to be true for ctenophores and for other sister groups to bilaterians. And so what they did here in this paper was they looked at cnidarian embryos and ctenophore embryos, and they wanted to see if they could find a common ancestry to the organizer, something other than sort of the root organism of bilaterians. So, they saw these examples across bilaterians, ctenophores, and cnidarians, and they looked at that and they said, what is the common ancestor of all of those different forms of organizer? And so that's what they did in this paper. We went through, and this is the sort of the shorthand here, where you have bilaterians, cnidarians, peripheral, which are sponges, and then ctenophores. And so cnidarians and ctenophores are marine invertebrates, as well as peripheral, but peripheral are sponges. So they're, I don't think they were studied in this paper. But anyways, the idea was to find a common ancestral form of this organizer across all these different groups of organisms in metazoa. And so that's the idea. And so they went through, they did a number of different experiments, and they showed some of that work here. And so, as it turns out, there are a number of transcription factors and proteins that are involved in this. It's basically the homologs and paralogs of a lot of the things you find in bilaterians. Then we did our Cognition Futures meeting, so this was on Wednesdays. We talked about the paper, The Dynamicist Landscape, which was, of course, a philosophically oriented paper that talked about the different gradations of dynamical systems theory in cognitive science. So if you're aware of the dynamical systems hypothesis, it was a hypothesis that was proposed maybe 30 or 40 years ago now, which is basically that cognition is a dynamical system. And there are different versions of it, but basically it's always about how you can't understand cognition unless you understand the dynamics of cognition. And of course, using dynamical systems approaches to get at this. And what this paper argued was that there are different forms of dynamical systems that distinguish, say, cognitive dynamical systems from other types of dynamical systems. Here's the paper, The Dynamicist Landscape. So if you're talking about dynamical or cognition as dynamical systems, that can mean that any dynamical system could be cognitive. And of course, that's not true. You need to distinguish between different types of cognitive systems and which ones of those are consistent with cognition. And so they go through all these distinctions, total state versus partial state, internal versus external, macroscopic versus microscopic. And so this is just showing some of these examples with respect to the data presented so far. They talk about neural manifolds. They talk about actually this Van Gelder paper from the 1990s, which was the first formal paper on this dynamical systems hypothesis. And the Van Gelder paper, of course, doesn't really get into the distinctions that we have today because people have applied dynamical systems in a lot of diverse ways. But in this paper, they try to address these things. So in short, at least, some cognitive systems are partial state, microscopic, internal, componential dynamical systems, illustrating the fruitfulness of the distinctions. Much more work on the nature of distinctions is required in particular how the distinctions can be formally analyzed and whether they are all orthogonal remains to be determined. So that's sort of the argument that they're making in that paper. So we went over that paper, and it gave us a lot of food for thought, especially with respect to some of our work on allostasis. So Avery's working on allostatic kind. They were thinking about the different ways in which we can apply dynamical systems to that problem. I was thinking about allostasis machines and how we can kind of bolster the theory in that area. Then there's this, Jesse was talking a little bit about JoPro and some of the things going on there. There's this talk from one of the people in Data and Direction, Violet Gordon. This is on large language model morality and talking about the facsimile problem in large language models. That we were talking about that as an up and coming topic. And then the AHA seminar series at MIT. And so those were our 2 meetings for the week. We also, of course, had an admin meeting yesterday, or what became an admin meeting. We talked about what we would be doing maybe later in the year. So as the summer comes to a close, we're kind of coming up with different things we want to do for the fall. And so it's, if people are interested in doing something for the fall, now is the time to kind of figure out what that is and try to plan for it. So Jesse, of course, has a cohort in Data and Direction. And, we talked about how they might interact with our group, maybe in the Saturday meeting, maybe in some sort of unspecified Friday meeting. And as people are aware, the open source meeting is usually a summer only thing. So we usually end the open source meeting in September or October and then shift to something else. Sometimes we have something else going on a Friday time slot. Sometimes we don't. But we kind of, because of our involvement in GSOC, usually our open source meetings are in the summer. Last year, I actually taught a class called Model Builder, and it was outside of the lab, but it's something that we might revisit, especially if people are interested in these topics in modeling and simulation. It's maybe something we can talk about as a group. I also mentioned that we might sort of return to this sort of these working periods or open working periods where you work out a problem in like an hour-long block. So we'll sit there and work out a problem and try to build something from that. Something we did a lot, early in the history of the lab, early in the history of DevoWorm, but it might end up being a fruitful exercise. So that's what we have for this week. So I don't know if Morgan had something you wanted to talk about or give an update at this point or what?
I don't know about, no, just I guess that's, like what I kind of proposed for the fall in terms of just, would that be, would that potentially be a good topic? And with the kind of like LLM cog sci of LLMs. And just like we will be doing this kind of initiative at the tower that's the Other Minds lab, and I think that's it.
Yeah, we did talk about sort of tie-ins to cognitive science as well. So I'd be interested in that. In terms of programming, I don't know if it's like in the form of like a journal club or maybe something else, because sometimes the journal club format can be limiting. But
Yeah. So certainly the idea was, um, it, there is a paper, but it's more like a practicum, um, where this is like this is a papers with code,
yeah,
you know, and so the I posted in Slack on the data sci. Um, I don't think it came out with a title. Sorry, internet's just a little slow here. Um, so if you see in uh, if you see in data sci ML, the last the most recent YouTube is actually it's Hugging Face, and it's a Hugging Face initiative. It's an interesting initiative where they try to recreate all the presentations from ICML.
okay,
Um, and this is, I should say, this is like a Hugging Face. I don't know if sponsor is the right term, but um, coordinated effort, like of a bunch of people. So it's like a bunch of people and their agents all try to replicate the um the like, how many did they say? I mean, it's like a large number. Like, the ICML this year had like 22,000 submissions, 22,000 paper submissions, or like a lot, right?
right,
And um and I didn't quite get the uh, uh I don't exactly remember the numbers, but it's just like they didn't do 22,000.
right,
Um but they did a lot. Like they did like a big chunk. And uh anyway, like obviously their purposes were a little bit different, but it does also get at this point where it's like, one, does a paper give you enough information? Right. um and so it's uh, I think there's interesting things just about um, how to so it's one thing to say papers with code, right? It's another thing to actually try and run that code and see, is it papers with code with enough information that actually lets you
right,
figure out how that should be run? Does it actually come with replication scripts, that include data and or prompts and or um, other important details, right? Is it as I've found with some of these, what again, if you care, we're not necessarily doing frontier model evals like a tester would at one of these labs. We actually want to see, you know how the sausage is made, so to speak. And so it's like we need the base model with intermediary checkpoints as at different stages of its development, right? So this is why it's like none of these papers should be using Claude or any of the proprietary models, because you don't have access to those, so what's the point? And so that's just not a valid object of study, right? And so so it's just like, who does have models that are like that, like, and to some extent, even the open source models, like of recent fame, like Kimmy and um, Inkling, don't have the same um, uh, kind of open science, like they're not exactly providing that full window to their development. So hence it's actually really useful that the Allen AI Institute has goes to the extra effort of providing something that is certainly um, a large enough model, or an advanced enough model that you can consider it a surrogate for study, but it actually gives you all those intermediary points, so you can really see how it's developed. And and that's the that's the link I added uh, um, earlier from Nathan Lambert, who's just finished up his course, really giving you a behind the scenes look at how these models are made. And he very much says, he's like, this is the course I wish I'd had like 2 years ago, when I was actually being tasked with doing this training. And yeah, anyway, and that's the other reason I've to bring it up, is that, like, this is such a rapidly moving target, but it is an object that we are interacting with, or more and more, perhaps whether we like it or not. And and so yeah, and yeah, I think there's, again, like, just interesting things in it from a anthropological standpoint. There's interesting things in it from a linguistic standpoint. So it's just like, um, uh, um, some of the, so I guess, just to fully explain the recent links that I dropped, then the other YouTube video is just an interesting evaluations, um, from from a kind of social psych lab, um, perspective, just in terms of how even our language, how your human language changes, as you interact with these models.
Right.
And which is the kind of, it's the very human thing that happens when you engage with a language partner, right?
Right.
So, as anybody with a close friend knows, you spend enough time with someone, and you kind of end up adopting their kind of mannerisms, or their kind of turns of phrase and things like that, right?
Yeah.
And yeah. So I think there's something interesting there, but it can also stay very um, it can stay very computational as
Right.
well.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think that's a good thing to follow up on. And again, like I don't know, like how we would approach it. Would it just be like kind of thinking about how to study it, or because I mean, I can't imagine there's too much prior work on this.
Well, so I mean that's also kind of this is the other interesting thing to me is that like I think there is a lot of work. I think it comes under a whole bunch of different names. Um, so it's just like so and on the one hand you've got the people that are super focused on like the arc challenge, right? So it's how do you um how do you work on the kind of long um the I don't know if long context is the correct term, um but certainly like long chain of thought
Right.
where you want the model to reason about something for many turns. um so there's that kind of work, um and these kind of like how to improve reasoning models in general, right? So even if it's just single turn, um uh you've got the people who are um actually trying to test these models, so it's this new area of evals in general, and where that there's evals that like meet the kind of commercial requirements, right? Then there's the group that are kind of like AI safety or alignment, where they want to ensure um, that the models um, are not only correct, I mean, not only um, they're not only meeting kind of like objective knowledge and reasoning targets, but you know, bring on less of their training biases, or um, and what do they do when given tasks about medical care and mental health care, and you know um, negotiating ethical challenges, right?
Right.
Which again is a bit more like a mirror than it is like a set of clear you must answer this way, right?
Right.
It's the kind of funny thing where it's just like it's until you start talking about these particular evals that people are like, well, wait, I don't think that way. Like, why did you think that was correct? And um, uh, yeah, um, but I've found some, again, I put all these references in the Mech and Terp, spinning up in Mech and Terp, and some funny groups, with names like Timaeus. I thought that was funny. uh, you know, but like a little like they're a little like what's um, Jonathan? Is it Goddard? Who the the kid that Steve Wolfram brought in to at the Wolfram Institute. Um, anyway, he's got a new AI company. He's at Princeton. He's got an AI company called like Layan AI, and it generates provably correct code.
Okay.
So it's just like it's like generating. It's not just generating answers and or code, but it's also generating lean proofs. You know,
Okay.
um, and like so some of these groups, these AI safety groups like Timaeus are doing that. you know so it's just like they're the only groups where it's like it seems like they're trying to exploit the same kind of mathematical structures that Anthropic talk about with their Jacobian lens, but they yeah but the but we generate lean we generate lean code, so it's correct or
Yeah.
something. It's like, and I just kind of want to bring up uh, I kind of want to bring up um uh, Girdle, but then it's just like, no, no, come on, they're doing something new.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's like, what do you think Girdle says?
Yeah.
But yeah, which is also a great um, topic that these things raise, right? Which is like, I mean, did you see the um, oh God, what was the funny title that they had for it? But it was like, uh, shoot, um, it's like a Google paper, um, and it's got a an obviously very it's got a very clickbait title. I mean, but it's like an archive preprint, but it's like basically an LLM can't be Einstein.
Oh, really?
Did you see this? Here, just one second. I can get on my iPad, but
All
but
right.
the um, anyway, the question though is like, you know, you understand why they go for something like lean,
Right.
but it does get it back at this question of just you know what kind of insight um, are you expecting from uh, um, from essentially a pattern matching tool.
Right.
Sorry, the dog is greeting me here. Um,
Oh,
so it's yeah, and they're trying to make the claim that these models as just fancy interpolation machines
right.
wouldn't be able to do the kind of um, um, you know conceptual reformalization um, that is sorry, it's a little loud outside. um, I'll move back upstairs.
All
um, that is that an Einstein you know was talking about, um, and no, but still, plenty, as we do know, these models are just computation, right? So, um, and I like it. I like thinking about just where someone trying to get involved doesn't have the tools, and there should, like, these tools give us the ability to fill in those holes,
Yeah.
which is kind of going back to the Hugging Face ICML. It's like we're using agents to to um, to replicate these papers, and I'm sure plenty of those papers themselves were
Yeah.
were these kinds of models.
I see a whole page of Google search results on. I searched an LLM can't be Einstein, and I got like why large language models fall short of Einstein, why AI still can't make creative leaps like Einstein, which is a Forbes article. Uh, this one here. The big reason Einstein would never have used AI. I think Einstein would have used AI, but that's just my opinion. The tagline: many think that intelligence should be outsourced to AI. Einstein wouldn't have used it. If he had, he would never have become Einstein, which is.
I like that. As soon as I'm searching, I see Einstein world models. I see Einstein neural fields. I see. I,
Yeah.
I had no idea these. I see one that's Allenstein, or I guess it's AI Einstein.
Yeah,
Numerical.
Einstein, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So all right. So already this is going to be, this is the other problem, is that you can't use Google inside a Google search. That is one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite uh, IT crowd episodes where
Oh.
the guys get her to say in a board meeting, like, please, nobody put Google into a Google search. You will break the internet. um, I'm not seeing that paper. That might be a harder search term to find.
Yeah.
But it's yeah. I mean, like I like thinking about getting yeah, having a project that you can point students to that can give them this kind of um, computation, give them access to these cog sci slash, again, it's there was just a lot of people who came out for this Anthropic paper talking about, like we've found its inner thoughts.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you yeah, they can only get away with it because the objects that they have created have some real complexity to them, and that complexity has that complexity can also be um, like a heat map on an early computer vision model. It's like that complexity has a language mapping, or yeah, like it has a probabilistic it has a probabilistic interior.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's um, So it's actually, again, it's like a good way to get people into the um, like, why should I learn linear algebra?
Why should I be Einstein? Really? I mean,
Right. Well, I think that one's it's easy to get people, excited about that. Um,
yeah.
Especially when you can tell them like he was bad at math, or like he got bad math grades. I think that's what everybody.
Yeah.
That's that was what appealed to me about Einstein. Yeah.
There's some interesting discussion going on around large language models, and it does tie into that dynamicist landscape paper, and that that was also a discussion about this idea of complexity and how do we interpret it with respect to cognition. So the dynamical cognition hypothesis is that you know you describe cognition with a dynamical system, and that dynamical system, because it has these universal properties, any dynamical system might be cognitive as well because it can reproduce those behaviors. And so, they kind of fits into what we're talking about here, which is you look at the output of a large language model and you say that looks pretty cognitive to me, but the underlying properties of the system are just a bunch of complex parts interacting probabilistically and getting an answer. And so, maybe that's what cognition is. I don't know, but that's the debate, I guess. Um, and so,
Yeah, 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 and right. I mean, it is. Uh, yeah, these are some things um, that it was. I just want to say the is it Talmo? The Foresight Institute meeting yesterday was really cool. Like the guy is uh, he's a former Google Brain guy, but now like does neuro AI at Salk.
okay.
And anyway, it was very much like trying, like, yeah, sure, we're training neural nets to do. It was kind of like the evolution of neural nets to um, to create a virtual rat, you know,
Okay.
and and what he was, so it was basically the most neuro AI, truly neuro AI talk that I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Because it was like the evolution of that to get to the point um, where he's got a model that's able, that is specifically fine tuned on real rat models, and this is the Netho lab. Um, this is the Netho lab. What would you call it? The goal, right? So this is a company that's selling itself as whole brain emulation, right? What do they mean by that, right? So if when you see this talk, you'll get a sense, because it's like they make a cage for they make a smart cage for recording freely behaving animals, right? but when you see it with the context that Talma gives it, it's you've got a biomechanical model of the rat, and you are training the neural network. But once that neural network is, or like with those real behavior, with that real behavior fine tuning, you then get this alignment of the model with the neurons. I mean, you know, like you want to say the real neurons, right? So he wants to say, I can now make measurements of my neural network and have them be I can have them be. He wants to say, I'm able to generate a digital twin.
Oh,
okay. And I think when you see it, you know, it was the first time where I was just like, oh, okay. If you want to call it, if you want to call it a digital twin, you know, like I shouldn't have a preference over whole brain emulation.
Yeah.
But it's important to say that this is still movement, right? Like they were able to get this fine tuning because of movement. You might want to say, well, hey, I can do that as well. He had some good slides I can drop into. He had a nice video from 1940s that did an animation of like a circle, a triangle, and interacting with a box, and it was just animation. But he was it was one of these, you know the thing, right?
Right.
Just in terms of you gave these things personality, or and so the question is, you know, can you build that up to get a brain model of cognition, right?
Yeah.
And you know, but here's the thing that I think is still I mean, it kind of comes back to these large language models, right? So what, well, there's still an artifact that has encoded all your limitations and biases and, you know, and errors. Like I'm still not sure if this is like the Holy Grail, but or you know, like it's still different than looking at a real brain.
Yeah.
It's you know, I think I associate whole brain emulation with consciousness uploading.
Yeah. Well, that's the promise, right? That's why they're doing it.
It's something. I mean, I feel like that's a little unfair though, because it's just like are they, you know, are they even that specific? You know, like I feel like consciousness uploading is just something, is like a goal that you can point to, whereas like in fact you're not really sure why you're doing it. Or like, you know, it's you know, it's for the greater good.
Right.
The
Consciousness
greater good.
uploading, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it's well, I mean, certainly in the kind of foresight circles and the AI safety circles, there's something very much about, you know, this is how we give this is how we give AI humanity, so that it doesn't decide to turn us into paper clips or something like that, you know. Right.
Yeah.
and and um, and that's very confusing to me. Or, you know, like um that's an Einsteinian step.
Yeah.
That I can't make, but just say that, like, certainly um Talma's talk was great. Like it really was interesting, um how you know, I I do, um he didn't get around to using it for something. It was like it was like it was like making the digital twin was the object, and I was just like, this is not the object. Like
Right.
if you've come close to that, now I'll make a prediction, right? So now it's just like, you know, um, what should I see when part of this system breaks? You know,
Right.
now I should be able to replicate, you know, disorders and disease or something like that. Excuse me. Um, uh, I'm just trying to think of, like, you know, how are um, yeah, just how are digital twins used? I mean,
Right. Right.
like, for, what's their purpose, and um, um, yeah, so you know, industrial digital twins are for looking at, you know, um, uh, objects that cost a lot of money.
Right. You don't want
To you don't want to, like, actually mess with real ones. So um, you want to look at failure states of, yeah, um, turbine engines and things like that, right?
to. Right.
Um, or yeah, like you need these to be operating at very high energies and difficult, kind of, they're dangerous, right?
Right.
And uh, I don't know. Um, uh, in my head, I'm just thinking about this, you know, kind of more VC person asking about this particular company, and um, and like I have a newfound respect with this presentation in terms of, like, well, okay, if you're coupling it um, to a kind of Mujoko virtual rat system, you know, you could really generate something that's an effective digital twin, where you know, it's a neural digital twin, right? Um, uh,
I'm still not sure that that's, like, I still feel like these companies are still selling themselves like an AI company,
Yeah.
that this unlocks, it's just like, you guys are just using neural networks, like they've been around a long time. Like,
Right.
they'll fit anything. Yeah, just like yeah. Anyway, separate question of the, uh, the business case for these things, but there's a lot there in terms of when I think a lot about my experimental psych education, and I had I don't think she was chair when I was. She chair? Yeah, maybe she was. So the psychobiology professor, I think, was the chair of the department, and so this was also the person where that gave us our. I mean, basically, this is the person we do rat surgeries.
All right.
And I'm convinced that was a poor use of our time. We weren't ready. And so I think about I would have preferred for us in experimental psych to actually be more computationally trained. Like what I see now are the kinds of things that I would have loved. We were more doing the kinds of operant conditioning, like that math was at least giving me something. There was something nicely mathematical about behaviorism, right? So this is pretty good in that regard, and he then kind of, I mean, he did the digital twin was interesting, but it was also he didn't go into it as much, but you can find in the kind of dynamics of the freely moving behavior. This is something that like the Memory and Aging Center at UCSF does for people, where it's just like, hey, if I have your motion capture data, right? And at this point, you can do markerless motion capture. I can diagnose your dementia from your movement, right? Yeah. And so there's something really interesting about the kind of computational phenotyping that is possible with this the combination of these sensor arrays and computational tools, right? that is yeah. And so he I think he talked about his tools SLEPA. It's like SLEP. SLEPA.
Yeah.
yeah, and you know, I've got a soft spot for anybody who has a recursive acronym. So LAPA is LAPA, you know, exploratory. I forget what the PA is, you know, but like it's yeah. And just some interesting, you know. So it's just like computational phenotyping when then applied to social behavior, or you know, to multi agent objects. It's not like computational phenotyping for for this kind of like dementia or something like that, right? But it's like, it's literally the computational computation, yeah. The computational phenotyping for multi-animal systems is like the kind of, you know, superhuman phenotyping. Yeah, so it's like you as an observer, because he talked a lot about, I mean, he was basically talking about computational ethology. And, you know, it gets back to this thing of like, well, at a certain point, you know, you can't actually get these computers to be better observers than we are. And yeah, just capturing, you know, 6 animals together and their behavior. Yeah.
So computational mythology is like, what does that mean?
Well, no, ethology.
Oh, ethology. Okay.
Yeah. So you know, he's just talking about like, he started with some videos of geese doing an egg kind of push, you know.
Yeah.
It's like a fixed action pattern.
Okay. Yeah.
And but he kind of ended with, you know, like so then he was kind of like moved to, you know, doing markerless motion capture, and you know what a lot of these groups call pose estimation kinds of things. And then where, you know, and then extending that to multi animal examples. And so one, kind of like the difficulty of the computer vision problem, but then 2, it's just like you can sort of understand the gait analysis differences in, say, dementia versus healthy controls, right? But when you start like you as just a human observer, when you start to see, you know, 6 animals moving around, right? You are not able to fit a model to all of those and capture those dynamics, you know. And so that's where it's like, it's kind of this combination of computational ethology with, you know, something like computational phenotyping of each animal. Where, for instance, you know, you get a hierarchical social structure, right? like that's something, you know. I mean, you know, I've read Jane Goodall and stuff, you know, like you can sort of slowly build up what relationships are, you know. But what what she was doing in a naturalistic environment, right? Like people at the Salk are trying to do in big arrays of cages, right?
Yeah.
Where and where they're not necessarily testing drugs or something, but they are doing all sorts of behavioral manipulations. And again, these are freely moving animals, etc. You don't have to. Something can be gained without actually, collecting brain data. I mean, having access to the skull or something like that.
Right.
Anyway, it was a great talk, and I definitely want to pull his papers, because I think they really are the most relevant to this. I was trying in this the link I put after the Luma event in on Slack is the GitHub project where I was trying to do something that was like, if Josh Bongard was redoing his course.
Oh, right, the Bongard course.
Right. Yeah. So he's doing the evolutionary robotics course, and I get why, or again, it's absolutely a programming course. I mean, he designs it as a programming course, right? So he says in the beginning, he's just like, I want you to be, in this course, you're going to write like 10,000 lines of code, and that's kind of like the goal. Yeah, right. Because this is how you become a programmer, as well as you understand these models. But he has some ambitious goals. It should be a year course, not a semester. Because he's got some ambitions at the end where you want something that's kind of neuro AI-ish, right? and this is definitely where things are. And the other thing I liked about Thomas' presentation is that he's using Jax, so it's not Mujoko. He's doing like MJX, or he's using the new the new Jax version of Mujoko. So it's exactly what I got in the Evo embodiment. Yeah, but with real training data. Yeah, so I want to definitely check his most recent archive papers and things like that.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. Yeah, definitely. We should revisit the robotics course, because there's really interesting stuff going on there.
Right.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because the whole spinning up in RL was OpenAI's. Remember when they were an open company?
Oh yeah.
It really was their training material for getting a couple models moving, So it's some of the arguments about the neuro AI were like, hey, when you're trying to train a virtual rat, and it fails, or like a lot of early attempts at your training will have the rat doing weird things,
Yeah.
So like, and I think everybody gets this with if you're trying to train a humanoid robot,
Right. Oh yeah.
that the kind of the leaps and things that it'll do, just
Right.
like weird things that actually become really understandable when you know the math, or like what exactly are you rewarding, right? And the problem is that you actually want to record, or like you want to reward kind of long-term behavior. So
Right.
it's just like how do you make it not be the first 100 milliseconds, which is what gets them leaping in the air. Yeah. Anyway, I think it'll be interesting to see if they've got any kind of additional resources for better training an animal, and virtual animal, and it's also just really interesting as someone who was an early user of the neurorobotics platform of the Human Brain Project. Like I think at home I still have a mouse pad that says neurorobotics.net, like was like early swag at a human brain conference, Human Brain Project, conference. And that like this is exactly, they were trying to do this before these models had taken off like they are currently. But at the same time, like the math is kind of the same, right? And the only difference is that like they had a bit more of an emphasis in using ROS inside the simulation, and their thought on this was, we want to make the sim to real transfer as simple as possible. So it's like every robot that was constructed was already using ROS. And so they were like, well, we should have ROS inside the simulation. I think that's something that Bongard doesn't do. Like, I don't think Bongard has makes the ROS inside the simulation. Even though he will eventually care about sim to real transfer. And yeah, anyway, just a funny fact about the neurorobotics platform. Is that it brought ROS, a middleware layer, from the real world into the I mean, I think it was also that they used Gazebo for their simulator, which is like is from the same project. It's I forget what's the I mean, what was Willow Garage, but it's like now it's like Open Source Robotics Foundation, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, I forget.
Mm-hmm. Just taking a note here.
Yeah. So I do have I mean, the spinning up in ALF, which is like the active inference, is is definitely trying to get you to embodiment. But the Evo embodied repo is the specifically like training off of Josh Bongard's course.
Yeah.
It's like training an agent off of his course, but using MJX and like
Oh yeah, maybe we can revisit that this fall. I've been thinking about like all the stuff that we've been talking about, and it's like, okay, we've just been looking at it. We haven't been using it. Any of your repos, and I've been doing some things. Yeah.
The one thing, and this kind of comes back to this question of are there reasons that justify actually becoming a nonprofit, which is he even says that like you need access to a bunch of GPUs. Some of their work was how to do that. I mean, like how to spread these difficult tasks across more than one GPU, and yeah, so it's just like that has been like I was able to do it, but like nobody should have to pay a couple $100 to produce the outputs of a paper, like a research paper, but I it's like even with Almo from AI Alan AI Institute, like I still needed to run some things to generate the output where it's just like I'm running on a bunch of H100s or something like that for I might only be doing it for 8 hours at like I forget what like $3 or $4 an hour, something like that, right? But like to do any of this kind of work also assumes this insane compute that like again these companies are pouring trillions. Yeah, anyway. So I don't know how to, that's the last bit that I'm trying to figure out, is like how to also give students access to something where they can at least play with real toy versions.
Yeah, that would be good to have like sort of a sandbox, but not something you'd have to pay too much for or much at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, this gets to like just can you get a small grant where that pays for compute for this.
Yeah.
And that is the sort of a benefit. It's like it's much easier to get money for compute than it is to get money for salary. So as long as like you don't want to actually pay anybody, like this is the bit where it's just like nobody actually knows how much compute is. So it's just like, we can give you compute credits, you know, courtesy of SoftBank or somebody. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to come back to this later. So yeah, I wanted to go over a few papers and things too. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, so recently, of course, SIGGRAPH was held, and they had a number of papers that were presented there. And this is the SIGGRAPH 2026 best paper. And so this is published in ACM Transactions on Graphics. And so this is something called Mixwell, sharp 2D fluid brushes for progressive physics-based mixing. So, at SIGGRAPH, they introduce a bunch of techniques, and, they work the techniques out, and then usually that's where people go to build tools for the next generation of image processing and computer graphics. So this is their website for the paper. They have the paper, the supplement, the video, and the talk. I like the way this is set up. And then they have the citation here in BibTeX and on the ACM. So this is going to just be kind of a description, and then there's some demos here that you can explore. So the abstract reads, we present Mixwell, a family of sharp two-dimensional fluid brushes and GPU-accelerated analytical methods for progressive resolution-independent physics-based modeling, or mixing, derived from idealized potential flow around a cylindrical tine. Mixwell includes a cusped Kelvin-Lutz-style regularized velocity brush that parsimoniously captures cylinder fluid interactions. Building on Maxwell's 1869 drift formulation, we developed GPU-friendly evaluation strategies for particle drift in both infinite and finite strokes. So this is a lot of technical detail, which I'll open the paper and we can look at. For image-based workflows, we introduced cylindrical reverse drift functions, or RDFs, displacement fields that encode time insertion, motion, and removal. Like sign distance fields in geometric modeling, RDFs compose naturally and can be chained in shaders to model complex operations while avoiding intermediate texture blur. We also propose a periodically exploiting composition scheme for complex RDF patterns. All Mixwell operations are evaluated independently per sample, enabling truly progressive mixing and rendering without global solves, grids, or intermediate texture resampling. We demonstrate real-time GLSL and HLSL implementations and production integrations in Houdini, enabling progressive arbitrary resolution mixing and rendering with negligible numeric dissipation. So this is kind of an example of the mixing patterns that they have here. So it does look like a kind of a fluid dynamics thing where they're mixing patterns and colors in these ways. So let's go to the paper. Okay, so this is Doug James from Stanford and Ethan James is an independent researcher. And so this is, this figure 1 is what we saw on the website. Progressive simulation of rendering in 2D fluid mixing. We have these Mixwell brushes that allow for different types of flows and modeling those as they interact with one another. Okay, so they talk about fluidic sculpting and mixing tools. So this is the class of tools that they're trying to develop an improvement upon. Fluidic sculpting and mixing tools are visually striking elements of modern modeling and animation workflows. Ad hoc geometric deformers can produce fluid-like effects inexpensively, but they often lack physical realism and incompressibility control. Physics-based fluid simulation can offer high realism and incompressibility, but it is computationally expensive, resolution limited, and prone to numerical dissipation and blur. And so then they talk about, in the abstract, they talked about Kelvinlets, which are these analytical deformation brushes, where it's a class of analytical deformation brush. They provide elegant closed-form flow fields, but do not precisely model fluid brush mixing interactions, and long strokes still require fine time stepping. In short, we lack a sharp, controllable, incompressible two-dimensional fluid brush that captures precise physical, time-like flow interactions and supports detailed arbitrary resolution fluid effects with negligible dissipation and blur at real-time rates. So that's what Mixwell is serving the purpose of. It's a special purpose family of sharp two-dimensional fluid brushes derived directly from idealized potential flow around an inserted cylindrical time. And then this is just kind of where they were drawing from in the abstract. Let's see. So they talk about the contributions here. This paper contributes 5 things to the field. The first is a sharp cylinder-derived incompressible 2D velocity brush suitable for Kelvinlet style interaction. The second is that we have position-level advection schemes for finite and infinite strokes based on drift coordinates. 3, GPU-efficient evaluation strategies enabling progressive simulation and rendering of fluid brush effects. Then number 4, we have these stroke-based reverse drift functions, or RDFs, with insertion and removal, supporting composable, blur-free image space mixing. And then 5 is a periodicity exploiting reverse drift function composition scheme for efficient modeling of complex repeated mixing patterns. So some very specific aims there. And I find it interesting that when you visit computer graphics research, as opposed to say like AI research, their aims are a little bit different, but actually not as much as you would think. They're actually trying to do the same types of evaluation and developing different mathematical tools. So there's a bunch of related work. The first is marbling and drift. So of course, when you're dealing with computer graphics, you're dealing with sometimes ancient artistic techniques and trying to replicate those on a computer. So the first thing they mentioned in their related work section is marbling and drift. So marbling is an ancient art practiced across many cultures with a well-documented history. The Maxwell connection is mathematical and direct. So in 1869, Maxwell modeled the 2D displacement of a fluid particle due to a passing cylinder using elliptical integrals, and explicitly suggested that the induced drift is a model for paper marbling. He even rendered a marble grid by hand, noting that if a maker of a marbled paper were to rule the surface of his bath with straight lines of paint at right angles, and then draw a cylindrical ruler through the bath up to the middle, and apply the painted lines to his paper, he would produce the design shown here. And this is actually James Clerk Maxwell, who of course is known for electrodynamics and other work, including the Maxwell's Demon. This is his sort of example here of what he was just talking about. So this marbled effect. See, it's like you have a marble that's moving through a fluid flow. So the marble is here, it's moving through the fluid flow here. And it's creating this deformation around it in the space surrounding the marble's movement, or the marble's moving against the flow, and it's creating this deformation accordingly. Later, Darwin, not Charles Darwin, independently advanced these net particle drift calculations, making them widely known. And the phenomena is often discussed as Darwin or Darwinian drift, despite Maxwell's earlier cylinder analysis. We revisit classical analytical drift techniques, adapt them for GPU simulation, and introduce a novel brush for Mixwell flow, modeling that enables fast and robust GPU drift simulation without elliptic integrals. For the classical drift model, we model the surrounding flow using classical potential flow, which is the incompressible irrotational motion of an inviscid fluid past a infinitely long cylinder. So this is where they're using this different types of flow to characterize this process here. Okay. While the velocity field and the streamlines are readily available, computing particle travel times and the resulting net displacement in closed form leads to elliptic integrals and semi-implicit relations. We evaluate these integrals using Carlson's symmetric integral forms and a custom Newton solver, both well suited for GPU evaluation, and compare them to the Mixwell brush advection scheme. So then they talk about deformation brushes, which are much more recently developed. This is basically this idea of interactive editing as the composition of local deformation tools. So this is something that has been around for quite a while in computer graphics. Early swept tool deformers include sweepers and swirling sweepers, regularized Kelvinlets, and other tools. Regularized Kelvinlets in particular provide closed form elastic deformation brushes derived as fundamental solutions of linear elasticity and incompressible fluid flow. So they're Kelvinlets, they're Stokeslets, and other things. So these are like, when you talk about Stokes flows and things like that, those are related to Stokeslets. Kelvinlets are related to this definition here. These physics-based brushes smoothly drag a local neighborhood along with the flow using a blob of force. So you have this blob of force, kind of like the marble that we saw in the last image, and you're dragging along this neighborhood of, cells or particles. And so it's kind of like moving this with the cylinder. So it's like moving things along with that object. Now you can do that, of course, and it works to some extent. It gives you a nice visual effect, and it models the physics as you might see them in a flow, but they do not specifically model the flow around a cylinder. So just because you can generate an image doesn't mean that it actually models the flow itself. And what that means is that there is no circular exclusion domain, that material flows around at different rates, including inducing singular drift. Surprisingly, the closest Kelvinlet approximation to our Mixwell brush is a two-dimensional cusped Laplacian Kelvinlet, which has an ad hoc construction but exhibits a similar asymptotic cusp profile and far-field decay rate after suitable parameter fitting. So that's a little bit about the Laplacian Kelvinlet. However, Kelvinlets are primarily used as displacement-based deformers for sculpting and space deformation. And then, of course, there are other people like Hedinger and Gastal who investigated real-time image deformation and video time warping using Newton-based inversion of regularized Kelvinlet brushes, which work best for small and smooth deformations but can incur image blur during sampling. Such approaches are less appealing for large and more sharp deformations or multi-brush interactions and complex mixing processes, all of which are difficult to invert numerically. Mixwell targets a complementary regime. So that is, sharp, incompressible two-dimensional fluidic brushes whose velocity fields are specifically derived from ideal cylindrical flow, which can then be used to construct cylindrical RDFs, which we defined earlier, for texture advection using reverse time advection solvers, and support arbitrarily long brush strokes without time step induced image blur. We rely on reverse time integration, cylindrical RDFs, and other techniques to perform large time texture advection and reduce image blur. Progressive quasi-static evaluation has been explored for cloth and shells, and for fluids via adaptive grids and multi-scalar reduced order enrichments. In contrast, Mixwell's 2D drift model admits accurate point-wise resolution-independent evaluation, allowing fluid deformation and rendering to be computed together progressively. Then they talk about analytical mixing flows, digital marbling systems, which is, we'll come back to that in a minute, image advection and blur avoidance, and characteristic map and flow math methods. So reviewing all these areas to get to sort of what they're doing here. Digital marbling systems are particularly interesting. Let's talk about that. And then maybe a little bit about flow maps, as this kind of relate to some of the things going on in machine learning, actually. So digital marbling systems are kind of like the marbling systems in art, and the sort of the 19th century and previous explorations of that. So there's a long history of digital marbling in graphics, but no analytical, physics-based, incompressible mixing brush has emerged that is consistent with cylinder flow. Geological marble patterns are commonly approximated using procedural noise. So this includes Perlin noise. And, this is something that again, if you see something in nature, trying to approximate it and trying to maybe not lock onto the process that created it, but lock onto some analog that can describe that pattern sufficiently. For 2D cryptographic marbling, the direct numeric simulation of the 2D Navier-Stokes equations have been explored for 2 decades. This has been done with something called stable fluids. However, these early systems suffered from numerical dissipation, blurring, and limited resolution. Subsequent work explored GPU-accelerated Poisson solvers and better advection schemes, as they mention here with the acronyms, culminating in Atelier M++ with GPU-accelerated USCIP and edge-enhancing filters to reduce blur. Vector graphics approaches preserve sharp contours but remain limited by their underlying coarse fluid grids. And so there's also mathematical marbling work, which proposed closed-form tool functions under incompressible, immiscible two-dimensional ink assumptions, emphasizing sharp contours, tractable inverses, and GPU backward mapping for real-time feedback. The radial ink drop insertion model is based on an equal area argument and is similar to our time insertion removal maps. This paper also introduces a sharp stylus-like brush that does not satisfy the incompressible flow assumption for finite strokes and is in fact what they call a grab brush. So in contrast, the Mixwell brush is derived as the physical pullback of the ideal cylinder flows velocity field through the area-preserving time insertion removal map, yielding incompressible Mixwell flow. And they compare that later in the paper. We derive both a sharp Kelvinlet style fluid brush and advection scheme for finite incompressible brush strokes, supporting image deformations of arbitrary resolution. And of course, they also have computationally hydrographic printing techniques that can simulate and correct for texture distortion when dipping objects into a water bath with an inkjet printed PVA film layer modeled as an elastic membrane, enabling precise alignment of surface textures on complex 3D surfaces. This is interesting work, like kind of going beyond just kind of generating things on a computer screen. We can actually print out the patterns using different methods. This other area that they review, which is characteristic map and flow map methods, is interesting because it deals with some things going on in machine learning and physics-inspired machine learning in particular. So again, we're dealing with fluid flows and fluid dynamics necessarily. And so we're trying to create these different types of flow maps and other things that can approximate patterns we find in nature. So these strategies belong to a class of methods for representing fluid transport as a composable flow map, rooted in the classical method of characteristics and applied to a 2D transient fluid flow as early as Weigert and Wiley, which is in 1976. Tessendorf and Pelfrey, 2011, later brought the term characteristic map to graphics, framing it as a generalization of gridless advection and the scheme above. In computational physics, the characteristic mapping method evolves a long-time flow map is a composition of accurate short-time submaps, achieving high-order resolution on coarse grids for linear advection. And the 2D incompressible Euler equations, and that was, In computer graphics, many recent works have explored this perspective. BiMach squared evolves bidirectional mappings on grids, covector and impulse formulations, advect velocity like covector quantities along the map to preserve circulation. Neural flow maps encode the spatiotemporal velocity field implicitly for long-term bidirectional advection. Particle flow maps assemble accurate long-range maps for Lagrangian particle trajectories, and Eulerian vortex methods advect vorticity along flow maps. In contrast, Mixwell's RDFs are built from semi-closed form analytical drift maps for potential flow around a cylinder, rather than numerically integrating maps from a simulated velocity field. Mixwell is therefore not a Navier-Stokes solver and is restricted to the specialized 2D quasi-static brush setting we target, but it admits pointwise resolution-independent map evaluation with no per-step integration error in the infinite stroke case and supports fast GPU shader evaluation. So this talks about different aspects of idealized cylinder flow. It gives the mathematics for that. It talks about Maxwell drift and time along streamlines. It talks about that for the equations on that. Classic analytical solution for drift. So we're doing a lot of things with drift. 2D drift for infinite and finite strokes. Infinite strokes and finite strokes. And they give the mathematics here. This section are figures that show some of the sort of the calculations in graphical form. So this shows Maxwell's time and drift curves for a unit cylinder moving to the right at some unit velocity of 1.0. So this just shows that the flow is going in this direction. The movement of this cylinder is to the right, and it's advecting in this way. And then this shows the different coordinate systems, so representing the cylinder and the flow in different coordinates, and its rotational field in different coordinates. And then some of these are graphs that show the magnitude of drift and other things going on there. Then they model finite strokes, which they're doing. I think doing this in Mathematica, so they show the math for that. And then all these different simulations are done in Mathematica. They have to define the math so that you know kind of what it's doing. And then they discuss these outputs. So this is, this is the 2D drift illustration, just showing drift. And then they show the Mixwell brush deformation, which is in figure 7. This is a bird-like figure marbled on a modest high-dimensional resolution raster using a real-time shader toy implementation. So this is going from this cylinder to this bird-like figure by this process. So it kind of goes from the cylinder, this set of concentric circles, and then that's deformed along the edges, forming the body of the bird, and then forming some other aspects of something that looks like a bird. So you see that this process of diffusion and advection produces this pattern. Okay, so I think that's enough for that paper. I did want to talk about that because I thought it was really interesting with respect to some of the other things we're talking about, especially some of the physics influenced models that we've been talking about. Okay, the other thing I wanted to talk about today was this article. I believe it's from a Substack, Infinite Faculty Substack. And this is called Symbols, Neural Networks, and Mathematical Intelligence. So this is, again, something we've been talking about earlier in the meeting and thinking about some of these aspects of connectionism and the basis of higher level cognition. And this is a little cartoon showing like a robot formulating equations. Okay, so let's start off here. Recently, a language model found a counterexample to the Jacobian conjecture, a widely known problem in mathematics that has been open for almost 90 years, and which has been somewhat notorious for incorrect proof attempts by mathematicians. So this is going to talk about how mathematicians use large language models and how this affects the field and how this is, how we interpret the things that we can get out of large language models, which is kind of an interesting area because mathematicians have been using large language models, and the question is if a large language model comes up with a proof, how do you evaluate that? And Terence Tao has been doing some really interesting frontier work in that area. The counterexample is remarkable in that, being a relatively simple equation, it fits into a tweet, which is how it was announced. So this is the tweet where it says, "Hello there, the Jacobian conjecture is false. Thanks to my close friend Akil for asking about it, and my other close friend Fable for working during the World Cup final." And then this is the mathematical statement here. If you happen to be literate in some undergraduate level algebraic geometry, Terence Tao wrote a very nice, detailed, and not too technical explanation of the counterexample. So this is the counterexample. This is from Terence Tao's blog. And it's a digestion of the Jacobian conjecture counterexample. So this talks about a little bit about this conjecture using Fable AI. So this is what they were talking about in the tweet. So this is so the notorious Jacobian conjecture can be formulated concretely over the complex numbers as follows: the condition that the Jacobian is a non-zero equivalent, or that df is a non-zero equivalent to f being locally invertible. And also, okay, so let's get down to where he talks about, what's good and bad about this, I guess. So it was recently shown using the Fable AI that the conjecture is false in 3 dimensions, and thus in higher dimensions as well. The conjecture remains open in 2 dimensions and is easy to establish in 1 dimension. The example can be stated completely explicitly, so one can take this equation and one can verify by a brief calculation that DF equals -2, and then this is the other part here. While this is an extremely quick verification, the construction presented in this fashion appears like a massive miracle. The polynomial f has degree 7, so a priori the Jacobian DF ought to be a polynomial in 3 variables of degree as large as 18, or 3 times 6 equals 18. So the fact that all non-constant coefficients of this polynomial vanish looks like a massive cancellation involving 1,329 equations, which is much larger than the 360 degrees of freedom for a generic degree 7 polynomial map of 3 variables. So finding such a polynomial looks highly unlikely to be located by brute force. This example has since been retroactively explained in more geometric terms. As a digestion exercise to myself, I sought to write this explanation with relatively little use of algebraic geometry in a manner that minimizes the amount of miracles required, although there are still a few places where some remarkable phenomena occur. And then going through a little bit about, kind of thinking over the solution here. Let me get to the end here. And he really kind of susses this out, I think. Okay. Okay, so just kind of working through, and of course he works through this using an AI chatbot. I've used an AI chatbot to discuss various aspects of this problem and to confirm several of the calculations made here. So he works through this whole thing himself in the AI chatbot, and really kind of, seeing maybe the pros and cons of the solution. And then there's some comments here, and I'm not going to get into the mathematics of this because I'm nowhere near being a mathematician. So this is just kind of the debate in the field. So the point here is that there's this sort of debate in the field about how large language models approach mathematical problems and how they solve mathematical problems. So that's kind of where we are with this. So anyways, the summary of this Terence Tao article is that he described the construction of this proof as appearing like a massive miracle, highly unlikely to be located by brute force. And so this counterexample is one of in a string of recent mathematical accomplishments of language models, consisting mostly of them disproving open conjectures. Another such example is the unit distance conjecture, which has been open for around 80 years. So last year, several language models achieved gold medal level performance on the International Math Olympiad competition. This person wrote a short thread about it, reflecting on what it meant about the relationship between symbol manipulation, reasoning, and intelligence in humans and machines, and arguing the developments aligned with the paper we wrote about symbolic behavior in AI. This was a paper that this person and colleagues wrote, Symbolic Behavior in Artificial Intelligence. And so this is just on the arXiv. The ability to use symbols is the pinnacle of human intelligence, but is yet to be fully replicated in machines. Here we argue that the path towards symbolically fluent artificial intelligence begins with a reinterpretation of what symbols are, how they come to exist, and how a system behaves when it uses them. We begin by offering an interpretation of symbols as entities whose meaning is established by convention. But crucially, something is a symbol only for those who demonstrate or demonstrably and actively participate in this convention. We then outline how this interpretation thematically unifies the behavioral traits humans exhibit when they use symbols. This motivates our proposal that the field places a greater emphasis on symbolic behavior rather than particular computational mechanisms inspired by more restrictive interpretations of symbols. Finally, we suggest that AI research explore social and cultural engagement as a tool to develop the cognitive machinery necessary for symbolic behavior to emerge. This approach will allow for AI to interpret something as symbolic on its own, rather than simply manipulate things that are only symbols to human onlookers, and this will ultimately lead to AI with more human-like symbolic fluency. Okay, so this is kind of the basis for this discussion as well. And thinking about how AI uses symbols, and of course mathematics is a lot of symbolic processing. I concluded last year's thread by noting that there's still a big jump from competition math to systems that could meaningfully contribute to progress in mathematical research, but things have been moving fast and I'm excited to see how they continue to develop. So that was last year in the thread on this paper. Since now it seems that AI can really make progress on long-standing mathematical problems, it seems like a good time to more fully expand these reflections on symbols, neural networks, and the nature of intelligence and mathematical understanding. So there are a couple of points that are going to be articulated in this post. The first is thinking about classic symbol manipulation. And that classic symbol manipulation is not an innate part of human cognition. Instead, it is something we learn with effort. Because of that, it is very often useful for humans and neural networks by extension to use external symbol systems, such as programs, as tools. And by doing so, we can learn to internalize approximation of these systems. Number three is that it is the very flexibility of neural networks that allows them to learn both regular and irregular structure that makes them effective in such a broad range of problems. The points above, 1 through 3, have been part of the connectionist view of neural networks since the beginning. So this is all part of this connectionist view, or the classical connectionist view, thinking about symbol manipulation and how humans use symbols. And so these themes then are central to understanding AI's recent progress in mathematics, where even though the core aspects of the field are classically symbolic, the process of mathematical reasoning reaches beyond symbol manipulation. To quote Paul Cohen, who's a Fields medalist, one must essentially forget that all proofs are eventually transcribed in this formal language. In order to think productively, one must use all the intuitive and informal methods for reasoning at one's disposal. So not just thinking in that stilted sort of symbolic system and its consistency, but just thinking in any way you can. And this is where the effectiveness of large language models comes into play. So in this post, I'll talk about the history of symbols and neural networks in cognitive science, discuss forays into mathematical cognition, and return to recent contributions of AI. So thinking about sort of the dawn of connectionism and the things that led into the dawn of connectionism, we have to go back to very early AI. And so before connectionist research started exploring neural network models of cognition, we used something called GoFi, which was symbolic in nature. These kinds of systems perform syntactic manipulations over symbolic structures, such as production rules, or logical inferences over logical expressions. So if you go back to Newell and Simon, they hypothesize that this type of classic symbol manipulation is the necessary and sufficient means for general intelligent action. And of course, this idea fell into disrepute once connectionist models really got rolling, and there was this divide between sort of symbolic models and statistical models. However, trying to make generally intelligent versions of such systems proved challenging in practice due to issues like the frame problem, which can be defined as the difficulty of constraining the explosion of propositions that such a system could possibly make about any action to just the important ones. So basically, if you have a set of rules and a set of propositions, you keep generating new exceptions, and you end up with so many things to evaluate that it's hard to kind of find the most important ones. So in parallel, the connectionists started to see the ability of neural networks to modeling aspects of cognitions, focusing on perceptual problems that were challenging for symbolic systems. So thinking about which parts of cognition were not well served by this sort of symbolic approach. So in particular, the parallel distributed processing of neural networks allowed them to do things like using context to constrain inferences and resolve ambiguities. This is, I guess this is chapter 7 out of some book. This is Modeling Cognitive Processes, the Interactive Activation Model. So I don't know what book that is specifically, but they talk about PDP modeling techniques in that article. Okay, so, but the connectionists also saw the potential of these systems to go far beyond perception. For example, acquiring the syntax and semantics of language, and one of the first applications of what might now be called a causal language model that predicted one word to the next. So this is very early on. The connectionists thought, oh, this might be a great, we might be able to simulate language in the way that we're doing our building our models. We could call it a causal language model that predicted one word to the next. It maybe even have the capability to reason. So this is 40 years ago in one chapter of the parallel distributed processing books entitled Schemata and Sequential Thought Processes in PDP Models. I guess this is let me see. Okay, this is this book, Parallel Distributed Processing. So I think that's where the other article is from. I'm not going to get into this article because I don't have permissions, but this was from Rummel, Hart, Smolensky, McClellan, and Hinton. This was chapter 14, Schemata and Sequential Thought Processes in PDP Models. The authors directly engage with the origins of human formal reasoning by external symbol systems. The passage I highlighted, and I'm not going to show the passage, this passage here, succinctly articulates a series of ideas that I would restate as follows. So the first is that humans are not inherently particularly good at logic, but we are good at finding patterns. So, using sort of logical propositions to model human behavior is folly. You want to look at pattern finding and pattern identification. Number two is it is therefore useful for humans to externalize symbol processing through writing symbolic equations. And so, this is what's useful, what's heuristic. And to state what thought is, you externalize symbol processing. Number three, this allows us to achieve certain systematic inferences, such as mathematical results, by a series of simpler steps to which we can readily see the solution. And number four, this is, of course, cognitive offloading. And we're offloading things into these environmental tools like mathematics or like symbolic systems. And this is the real symbolic processing. And this is, in fact, the primary kind of symbolic processing that humans do. Number five, by learning through using externalized symbols, not internalized symbols, we can then learn to internalize approximations of these systems. So if you write down a set of equations, you can then internalize those and approximate from those systems or reason from those systems. So if I show you a proof, you can reason from that proof. If I can't show you a proof, if I'm just communicating what's internal, then it's harder for you to reason from it. And it's harder for us to share that information, reason from the same source. So in simple cases, this can obviate the need to actually use the external versions after learning. So we may not need to use the external versions. If we know everything that's going on, we can do it from memory. An important part of expertise, even for domains like science, engineering, or math, is precisely the ability to see patterns, allowing us to make efficient inferences. And so I will argue that this set of ideas closely approximates the way that current AI systems engage with mathematics. So this is Rage Against the Connectionist Machines, and it's about the Fodor and Pilschen critique of connectionism. And so Fodor and Pilschen rejected connectionism, and they argued that it seems indubitable that cognition is syntactically systematic. For example, that it is impossible for humans to understand one sentence and not understand another syntactically equivalent one using the words they know. They argued that this systematicity was due to the compositional structure of human mental representations. So, for example, that we represent a sentence in a way that combines our representations of its components in a way that preserves their structure. Since syntactical symbol manipulation systems were a natural way to achieve such compositional systematicity, Fodor and Pilschen concluded that the only way the connectionist models could model higher level cognition models would be as a mere implementation of a symbolic process. These arguments, together with similar ones from others, drove a long-standing trend to dismiss neural networks as only capable of modeling simple perceptual processing rather than real higher level cognition, which is both symbolic and systematic. For example, while data-driven neural network-based AI algorithms effectively model machine perception, symbolic knowledge-based AI is better suited for modeling machine cognition, or the right move may be to integrate deep learning, which excels at perceptual classification, with symbolic systems, which excel at inference and abstraction. So this is just kind of a thought about like kind of the Gary Marcus approach of, or the thing that he advocates, which is of course neuro-symbolic systems. Now one might think a potential merger on analogy to the brain. Perceptual input systems like primary sensory cortex seem to do something like what deep learning does, but there are other areas like Broca's area and prefrontal cortex that seem to operate at much higher levels of abstraction. Like the earlier advocates of symbols, these perspectives suggest that what's going on in the brain to make intelligent inferences is fundamentally symbolic processing, and that neural networks are not suited to these types of inferences and perhaps just to perception. So, of course, there was a connectionist response to Fodor and Pilschen, basically refuting that argument. A couple of points there is the first one is that the putative symbolic structures of human cognition are sometimes helpful, but often misleading approximate characterizations of the emergent consequences of the real underlying processes. Then, of course, the benefits of connectionist models include their ability to capture graded structure, such as the quasi-regularity in exceptions to the English past tense conjugation, not just rigid symbolically specified structure, so it allows us to innovate and to capture irregularities in the language structure that aren't captured by just throwing a bunch of symbols up. Like in mathematics, you have a more formal symbolic process where everything is really kind of highly regular. And in fact, natural language is a lot of quasi-regularity. And then third, the systematicity of human cognition relative to neural networks is often overstated. So even adult humans might achieve only 70 to 90% agreement with systemic generalizations in real empirical tests when they are taught something novel. Hence why external symbol systems that can support human reasoning are useful. So this last point is important to the context of mathematical reasoning. And then what he talks about here is that he brings up some personal experience with the fallibility of human mathematical reasoning. And so, this is something that he sort of derived from his experience as undergraduate teaching math classes, and even advanced smart students, people who are pretty well versed in their field, often struggle to correctly apply things that they had learned previously in a new domain like calculus. So domain transfer or transfer of training was very hard, even for the experts. The other thing he noticed is that different ways of presenting things often helped different people to understand. So cognition plays a key role in mathematical reasoning, and it's in particularly non-symbolic ways. But it's not just regular humans with limited mathematical experience who are fallible. Even professional mathematicians often make errors. Daniel Witt has another nice thread about a series of errors in the published literature that he and his collaborators discovered while trying to prove a theorem. Indeed, the Jacobian conjecture itself has become somewhat infamous for the graveyard of flawed attempts to prove it. This rate of expert errors is strictly symbolic domain seems surprising if human reasoning were indeed built upon classic symbolic reasoning, the type that is guaranteed to be systematic. And so he mentions here that he mentions actually Saunders Maclean's work on mathematical reasoning and how mathematical reasoning is driven by intuition. Symbol systems are tools that act outside of a language model. So again, we have to think about symbol systems being sort of outside the domain of a language model, but part of this cognitive ability that they have. So with that perspective, let's return to AI and mathematical reasoning. I think that the progress in AI has largely followed the perspective the connectionists outlined. In particular, the generality and performance of the systems on the IMO actually improved by removing strict symbolic structure built into the system. In 2024, DeepMind system relied on reasoning with the lean symbolic language. We talked about this earlier. And using the language model simply to guide a tree search. This system required manual human formalization of the problems. Even with this additional help, it only achieved silver medal level performance. However, the following year, a system that reasoned end-to-end in natural language achieved even better, gold medal performance, removing the constraint that reasoning be strictly verifiable in terms of steps, and actually improved overall performance. This allowed the model to write correct proofs to more problems, while leaving the proofs relatively readable at the end. And so this year, similar systems are making progress on problems that mathematicians have not yet solved, thus conveniently avoiding the common claim that the progress of language models is simply due to memorization. We don't know the full details yet of how these proofs were achieved, but we do know from the announcements that both the Jacobian and unit distance conjecture results were achieved by general purpose language models, not specifically designed to solve math problems. These systems probably wrote equations or even more programs along the way. They may have also used symbolic solvers for formal verification of the result. But that stage, I argue, is irrelevant for the cognitive issues as originally discussed, just as when a human mathematician uses any of these tools. Indeed, everything I have described is deeply in keeping with the connectionist perspective I outlined above. And so, it is useful for both humans and models to sometimes use external symbol systems as tools for thinking and verification, both in learning. So DeepSeek Math V2 version 2 is an open source effort at this. But in either case, the intelligence that drives the proof is not a classical symbol system. Instead, it is the intuitions and ability to see patterns and paths to solutions that are key to effective mathematical reasoning, abilities that general purpose language models have started to emulate. And then this is just kind of going this last part here. Thus, while there have been various attempts to reinterpret the recent successes of language models in mathematics, it's really about the success of neuro-symbolic methods. I think that this should not be interpreted as any sort of victory for symbolic accounts of cognition itself. Instead, I think that recent research is clearly following the vision that connectionists laid out originally, that classic symbol systems are useful external tools for an intelligent system to use, but that those symbol systems are not the intelligence itself, even with higher level human cognition that behaves more like a neural network than a classical symbol system. External symbol systems can be partially internalized in such a network, or in humans through effortful practice, but even if they remain fallible or graded, I think a much more faithful description of how mathematical reasoning proceeds in both humans and language models than Forder could imagine. So this is just kind of rebutting a lot of the critics of connectionism in terms of this distinction between symbolic systems and sort of connectionist systems. So I don't know if Morgan had some things to say about that.
Well, I mean, really interesting, right? I mean, yeah, nothing concrete at this time,
Yeah.
but but super interesting, and again, we need to get we need to have a proper collection of the papers you cover. I mean, like where to find the links.
Yeah.
Because there's a bunch of things in there that I really want to follow up on. I mean, I remember what got me excited. I can't even remember this guy's name now. It's Polish mathematician. Did a talk at like High Data Warsaw or something like that. Like, and it was he was pitching deep algebra. I think it was like, God, can it be this long? Like, was it like 2015 that Karpathy, when he was still like a student or postdoc or something, like Karpathy trained a model. I mean, he basically did a language model fine tuning using publicly available mathematics textbooks, something like that. Do you remember this?
I think so. Vaguely familiar.
And it was like, ooh, the possibilities, right? And now, I mean, I think just last night I saw SARE, the Tau led, I don't actually know what the acronym stands for.
Yeah.
I bet it's not a recursive acronym.
No.
And that was a mistake.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you saw this, but like they just completed like some sort of complete mapping or solutions for the inverse Galois polynomials or something of like 24th degree or something like that. Like,
Yeah.
this announcement of, we mapped all 12,000 of them, where there's obviously a combination of reasoning models and calculations and knowledge graphs and yeah, like
Right.
a much more extensive hybrid it's like what he's talking about in terms of just you use the scaffold and the tools to solve the problems,
Yeah.
but your domain is still that these are historically cognitive challenges.
Yeah.
And anyway, that was just a really nice, it was kind of a nice overview that also brought in a lot of references that you and I are familiar with.
Yeah.
being from a different era.
Yeah.
Not always talked about by the kids today. And yeah, I mean it's the with the Other Minds Lab, the only it's good for it not to be all encompassing, but it's like I do it's an interesting time to be a mathematician.
Yeah.
and I think you were talking about the time when Skype was new, and that even tools, you think back to these I mean, not necessarily Erdős problems themselves, but like the time where mathematicians could only communicate by letter.
Right.
And that was considered a collaboration. I mean,
Right.
the funny thing being that, like, we have the record of this in like literally the 17th century, right?
Right.
So it's like, okay, it's into the 20th century, we were still doing it the same way that people were doing it hundreds of years ago. Yeah. Anyway, it's the time for collaboration and it's not crowdsourcing, but it's like these tools are cognitive. They can be cognitively augmentative in all sorts of ways.
Right.
Even with this, I mean, I'd like to link this to some degree with open source projects, where the best, or just by having other examples around, you get that kind of behavior from people, like open source is a kind of pay it forwards,
Right.
like social contagion.
Yeah.
And anyway, I'm getting off topic, but yeah, interesting.